Welcome back to the second of two SY1 screencasts analysing ownership and control of the media. In the last screencast, we looked at who owns the mass media and we considered the concept of media concentration, the idea that a small number of media corporations now control most of the mainstream media. And in this screencast, we're going to examine who has the most control over these corporations. Is it the owners? Is it the people who work for these media companies? Is it the editors and the journalists? Or is it ultimately the audience? Now, the traditional Marxist approach argues that the concentration of media ownership in the hands of a few corporations enables their owners to control media output and to send out to the audience ideas which are in the interests of the rich and powerful ruling class. So this is therefore a top-down theory of media control. From this perspective, the media are seen as an instrument of the ruling class, controlled by the owners, who are able to manipulate media content and media audiences in their own interests. In fact, in the past, many of the leading owners of the British newspaper industry, what were called the press barons, openly boasted that they ran their newspapers for the express purpose of propaganda that reflected their own political views. For example, this guy, Lord Northcliffe, when he was owner of the Daily Mail, Daily Mirror and the Times, once stated that God made people read so that I could fill their brains with facts and later tell them who to love, whom to hate and what to think. Now, in the last screencast we looked at News Corporation. We looked at News Corporation as an example of a media conglomerate that has a significant share of the UK media market. Now, the main shareholder of News Corporation, the main owner, is this guy, Rupert Murdoch. And many journalists and editors who have worked for Rupert Murdoch have complained that he has directly interfered with editorial decisions. And in fact, at the Leveson inquiry, which was sparked by the phone hacking scandal, Rupert Murdoch admitted that he does control the political line taken by The Sun, one of the newspapers that he owns in this country. And in the run-up to the controversial invasion of Iraq in 2003, every single newspaper owned by Rupert Murdoch around the world backed the US-led invasion. And this was a stance that reflected the personal political views of Rupert Murdoch on this particular issue. And according to a former editor that was hired by Rupert Murdoch, Rupert Murdoch constantly interferes with editorial decisions. In the words of Eric Beecher, the consistent ideology of Murdoch's newspapers is maintained by phone and by clone. And what he means by this is Murdoch tends to hire people that are similar to him in terms of their political views, and he's constantly interfering in their editorial decisions. So according to the traditional Marxist perspective, the role of newspaper editors, the role of journalists, the role of other media professionals is not as important as the role of the owners. Media managers have to follow the wishes of their owners. Journalists depend on owners for their jobs and are therefore unlikely to run stories which would challenge the status and the authority of their owners. Now, the second perspective that we're going to look at is a perspective called neo-Marxism. So this is a newer version of the Marxist perspective. And like the traditional Marxist approach, this theory also argues that the mass media spread a dominant ideology which justifies and legitimizes the power of the ruling class, the power of the wealthiest people within society. However, it differs from the traditional Marxist approach by suggesting that this is not carried out normally by the direct control of the owners of media companies. So they see a smaller role for the media owners. Instead, this is a perspective that recognises the power of owners, but suggests that they rarely interfere in the running of their media companies. And instead, this is a theory that emphasises the idea of hegemony. And what hegemony refers to is the dominance in society of ruling class ideology over other groups, including media managers and journalists. So according to the neo-Marxist perspective, the owners of the media rarely have direct control over the content and day-to-day running of their businesses. And furthermore, many media conglomerates are owned by many shareholders rather than a single owner or family. So from this perspective, media owners may exercise what we call allocative control, which is the power to define the overall goals of the organisation and to allocate financial resources, but they don't have operational control of their media businesses. So operational control refers to the day-to-day control of the media, and this is left largely in the hands of managers and journalists. So from a neo-Marxist perspective, the role of media owners is very much in the background. What's more important, if we're looking at the day-to-day running of media organisations, is the power of media professionals. And this autonomy may mean that sometimes media professionals might include some content that is actually against the interests of the owners and their social class. However, neo-Marxists argue that in practice media professionals rarely criticise the ideology that is shared by the media owners. And this is because if you look at the social background of media professionals, and here we can see the newspaper editors of the main newspapers within the UK, they tend to be from quite privileged social backgrounds. So they tend to be white, they tend to be well educated, they tend to come from quite affluent backgrounds. And this means that they've already been socialised to accept and value the ruling class ideology, and are therefore unlikely to have political views that are significantly different from the owners. So according to the neo-Marxist perspective, the views of white, rich men are often presented as the common sense view within the mainstream media, and any other views are taken less seriously, are ridiculed, or are represented as being extremist. And this leads, according to Owen Jones, to the demonisation of groups at the bottom of society. So because media professionals are not from working class backgrounds, they're more likely to believe in negative stereotypes that demonise that particular section of society and blame them for a whole variety of problems. Now, despite the different emphasis that they give to the role of owners and media professionals, the traditional and neo-Marxist perspectives share much in common. So both of these perspectives argue that the media output is not neutral. It reflects the interests of the rich and powerful because it's been filtered through a value system that contorts the reality of society. So they argue what the audience receives is not a window to the world. We're not getting an impartial reflection of society through the media, but instead what we're receiving is a deeply biased and subjective interpretation of society which reflects the interests of the dominant, powerful social classes within our society. Now, this view of the media as an ideological institution of social control has been criticised. Many sociologists would argue that media audiences are not as gullible, not as easily manipulated as these approaches suggest, that people can accept, reject, or interpret media messages depending on their existing ideas and experiences. And these types of criticisms lead us on to our third and final theory called pluralism. So the pluralist perspective, which is sometimes called the market model, rejects the idea that the mass media represents any one particular point of view. Instead, this is a perspective that focuses on the diversity of views, opinions and representations that can be found in the mass media. And therefore this is a perspective that rejects the Marxist idea that the media simply transmits a dominant ruling class ideology. So unlike the Marxist approaches, the pluralist perspective inverts the pyramid. From this perspective, it's media audiences that are ultimately in control of the media. In other words, the mass media are mainly seen as a vehicle for public opinion. And in this way they would argue the media are similar to any other commodity in a capitalist society where the consumer is sovereign and the products on sale reflect the laws of supply and demand. And they would argue that the size and diversity of modern media corporations means that media owners cannot control what is produced. And although they would agree that day-to-day decisions about media content are taken by media professionals, they would argue that these decisions are primarily based on the demands of media audiences, that the customer, the consumer, is ultimately in control. In other words, from this perspective, the strongest influence on media content is the reader, listener and viewer. So from a pluralist perspective, the content of the mass media will therefore show the full range of views, opinions and interests that are present in everyday society. So they argue that the mass media reflects the world as they see it merely as a mirror held up to it. So any bias or prejudice in the media merely reflects the world as it merely reflects the bias and prejudices that we find in society as a whole. So all questions about the content of the mass media can be answered by the observation that this is what the public want, no matter how trivial, sensationalist or irrelevant that it may appear. Nobody is forcing readers to buy tabloid newspapers or to watch television any more than they can be made to buy any other type of product. And the public also has a considerable number of opportunities now to directly influence the content of the mass media. And this is particularly the case with the new media that we associate with Web 2.0, which is turned audiences not just into passive consumers of media content, but also producers of their own media content. So a lot of media nowadays is based on user-generated content, such as citizen journalism, and the internet and emails have enabled audiences to respond instantly to media output. And if we look at the output of news and current affairs programs, they've increasingly made audience reactions an integral part of their broadcasts.